Dear friends, as many of you have asked me to publish the original version of the interview with Joti Brar without the translation to Russian, so here it goes. I don't want to accept any remarks about my pidgin English, as we focus here on internationalism, not on grammar nazism. Any other comments are very much welcome. So, ladies and gentlemen, comrades, our today's guest, Joti Brar, joins us from London. Jyoti, first of all, I wanted to ask you, how is London today? And I'll explain why I'm asking this, because for a long time, London was one of my favorite cities. I was there on a regular basis. But at some point, I started to realize that the decline is visible. You can see more and more homeless people, even in the central part of the city, not saying about the outskirts. I don't know, maybe it's just my impression. Maybe you see it differently.
Interesting question. You know, the British government has actually done quite a clever job at hiding the extent of homelessness in Britain. We go through periods where it kind of builds up in the streets, and then suddenly it kind of vanishes again, and it's like, oh, everything's fine. The reason is, in fact, the homelessness level in Britain is growing all the time. But what tends to happen is the British government creates a system of privatized temporary accommodation. So they pay hotels and bread and breakfast places to just become permanent homeless shelters. They're very unsafe for a lot of people because they're not really secure. Bad things happen, especially to women and children in those places. Whole families can be shoved into one room. They're off the street. When you meet them at school or work or in passing, you don't know that they're basically homeless. And they can be there for a very long time because we don't have social housing to move them into. So there's a kind of clean up the streets operation, which is quite effective in making the streets look like our homelessness problem has gone. But when you read the reports from the charities that actually deal with homeless people and do the surveys and the research into this, what you find is homelessness in Britain is growing massively still. In terms of the streets of London generally, as across all of the country, and in some parts of London are not as bad as the rest of the country, what you find is basic repairs to roads and infrastructure are just not happening. And the roads get worse and worse and worse, more and more potholes get bigger and bigger. It seems like a small thing, but it's really a sign of, the place is just kind of crumbling in front of you. Lots of our infrastructure doesn't work properly. Around where I live down in the southwest, a bridge was closed recently, and it's a bit of motorway infrastructure that they basically has run out of its lifespan unexpectedly. And it's unexpected because they don't have enough inspectors to go around and keep on top of maintenance and repairs in a routine way and in a planned way. So all of our maintenance happens after it should have done as an emergency. And what very often happens is things just have to be closed down in a hurry. So where I live, this has created a massive issue of it's a major route and loads of roads being closed. And it's going to be like that for like 2 or 3 years because it's a big project and the council doesn't really have the money to sort it out. So they just do all this temporary roadworks, which are kind of semi-permanent. So we have this situation, everything is dirty. There's litter literally everywhere. And that's even if you're not living in a city like Birmingham, where they've got a bin strike on right now. That's a whole other issue. But the streets are very, very dirty. There's litter and rubbish everywhere. And consequently, people don't kind of take pride. They don't try to look after the spaces where they live because they feel like nobody else is looking after them. So that's a kind of very much a catch-22 situation. Places aren't kept clean, then the people who use them don't bother themselves either because bins aren't being emptied, streets aren't being swept. Even in the countryside, because rubbish collection is inadequate, and especially for large items, poor people are being asked to pay to have large items taken away. So they end up fly tipping. That means just dumping rubbish in the countryside where nobody sees them do it. So, we have a real growing litter problem as well in Britain. And it's very noticeable if you're of a certain age, because it didn't used to be like this. I mean, my father arrived in Britain in 1962, and he said the first thing he noticed was how clean everything was. That was his impression when he got off the plane and arrived in London, was like, wow, this place is so, he felt like you could eat your dinner off the street. Now that is a distant memory now. My husband, when he was younger, spent quite a lot of time in Africa. And when he came back, he said, London has become a third world city. And in many ways, he's right about that. The level of crumbling infrastructure, litter, dirt, homelessness, poverty, all of that. And poverty next to wealth, is very stark contrasts everywhere.
A super wealth. I mean,
Super
if you go to
wealth.
Canary Wharf, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, but this kind of process goes slowly from the times of Thatcher with her neoliberal policies, right?
Yes. So as a Marxist, I describe it slightly differently. Really, Thatcher's government was chosen to begin the serious business of dismantling the welfare state that had been put into place after World War II. That was put into place in a very particular set of circumstances. It's not actually normal, even in a rich imperialist country, for the whole of the working class to have its living standards lifted up to a level that's relatively decent. This was a phenomenon that only took place after World War II, and it only took place because, number one, the workers were angry and armed. Number two, the communists had huge prestige. And number three, the Soviet Union had just won the war. And workers everywhere had looked at the Soviet Union all the way through the 30s and then through the war and seen how their planned economy was enabling the country to evade the huge depression that everywhere else was suffering from. Workers in the West were having the most horrendous time during the 1920s and 30s through the Great Depression. They suffered the charnel house of the First World War, then the Second World War, very soon after it, and fascism and everything. The revolutionary tide was very, very high. And if the imperialist countries had not granted huge concessions to the workers in that condition, in those circumstances, they would have found themselves swept aside by socialist revolutions all across even Western Europe. So a lot of people alive today don't really understand the historical context. They believe the kind of schoolroom kind of textbook version of history, which is Labour is a government of the people, and capitalism is a system that wants to make things better for people, and we in the West have civilized values and take care of our people. And in fact, the values that brought us the things we really care about in Britain, like our free schooling and free hospitals and the NHS and those type of things, and what we did have was secure jobs and pensions. All of that is socialist values. It's not capitalist values. What happened really with Thatcher was that by the end of the 70s, there was an urgent need for the imperialist ruling class to dismantle all this very expensive welfare provision, because the post-war boom was well and truly over. The global overproduction crisis was making itself felt once more. There was a crisis of profitability. British industry was not competitive on a world scale without big subsidies or without a huge investment to re-equip it with modern machinery. A lot of British industry still had Victorian machinery, and it was able to get away with that because it owned a huge empire and could monopolize their markets. But after World War II, increasingly, it had to share those markets with the USA, with Germany, with countries that it couldn't compete with, and with the countries that were being reindustrialized by the imperialists to prove that capitalism works, like Japan and West Germany. And British machinery couldn't compete in those markets and with those producers without re-equipping itself, changing the basis of its production with modern machinery. the British financier class was not really interested in making that huge investment. It would rather close down that industry and just invest in production abroad in the third world where they could make huge profits. So this attack both on the decaying industrial base of Britain and on the welfare state required a kind of new consensus of the ruling class. After World War II, across the board, all of the ruling class and all the bourgeois parties agreed that the priority was to provide a welfare state that would bring down the revolutionary mood and create kind of social peace. Once that had been done, and the working class was very much lulled to sleep in that period, very much got the idea that we're having a steady move, peacefully parliamentary road through this progress to socialism, and we're going to have a better life step by step by step, and all these gains we've won are permanent. And of course, because the Communist Party bought into this idea that this is all permanent, can't be taken away, and we will, through parliamentary means, through the Labour Party, we're going to steadily get to socialism, the radical section of the working class basically was disarmed. It was theoretically destroyed. And class consciousness was gradually eroded in Britain. So when the Thatcher government headed up this campaign by the ruling class to start destroying Britain's industrial basis and the welfare state, the resistance they met was just not nearly as strong as it needed to be. And the really big fight that was put up by the miners, they had always been the kind of spearhead of the British working class. They were viciously attacked, and the ruling class put absolutely everything. We're at the 40th anniversary now of the end of the miners' strike. That strike took a whole year, and the ruling class spent several years preparing for it, because they understood that if they could take down the miners, they could take down the rest of the organised working class, which is precisely what happened. It was the last big organised resistance of working people, and that's now 40 years ago.
How were they preparing for it?
So some years before the miners' strike, I forget the year, maybe 78, I could be wrong, or 70, maybe 76, a bit earlier. But there was a previous miners' strike where the ruling class tried to take on the miners, and they lost. And not only did they lose, it brought down the government. It brought down the Tory government of Ted Heath. And the ruling class realised it had to think again, because the miners were very prepared to defend themselves and their jobs, and they were able to mobilise a lot of the working class behind them. So things they did to prepare were, for example, they spent years bringing in and laying up reserves. So through imports and through getting miners to kind of work overtime, they were building up stocks, reserves of coal, so that through a strike, they could keep the energy grid powered. They did things like they brought in a bonus scheme for production, which basically favoured one section of miners who happened to work in an area where the coal's very easy to get out of the ground. Right. And so they created a kind of scab area of the country where these miners were going to be doing very, very well and not going to be interested in going on strike. And they encouraged the formation of a separate breakaway union for those miners, which basically acted throughout the strike as a kind of scab force. They also bought off some leaderships of other unions that ought to have been allying with the miners, like the electricians, and I forget all of the details. I haven't looked at it too recently. But so there were various things they were preparing for over that time. And by the time of the miners' strike, it was actually, if you read the documents at the time, contemporaneous reports, there were many moments through that strike it was touch and go. And actually the thing that swung the balance, it wasn't the ruling class's, primary forces. It was their secondary forces inside the working class movement. It was the Labour Party and the TUC leadership, which consistently and throughout the period sold out the interests of the miners, and by doing so sold out the interests of the entire working class. There should have been full sympathy and coordinated strikes, in steel, at the docks, with the hauliers, with the railwaymen. There's a whole load of things that if the TUC had been doing its job, then actually the strike would have ended much quicker and with a massive victory. But the Labour Party and the TUC consistently stabbed the miners in the back. They worked, in fact, with the ruling class to bring about the defeat of the miners. And of course, the other major front was the media front. And the TUC has always persistently ignored the media front of imperialist wars, whether they're wars against the working class at home or wars against oppressed peoples abroad. The media, the propaganda is hugely important. I think during the 1 year miners' strike, there was maybe 1 or 2 occasions where print workers refused to print a particularly egregious headline. So that did happen, but like not nearly enough. You know, huge torrent of lies was poured on the British people. The miners, you know, were really vilified, you know, on a daily basis in the press from all directions, and working people who weren't in touch with miners got a very wrong idea about what was really going on. In fact, I was a school child, but I remember, because my parents were politically active, going to rallies and hearing Arthur Scargill talk about the fact that the miners weren't only defending mining jobs and Britain's coal industry, they were actually defending all jobs. They had understood that this was the beginning of a huge attack on the working class. And if the working class did not rally and support the strike and bring about a victory, they were going to be next. And they had a slogan that said, support the miners, fight for jobs. And Arthur Scargill made it clear he wasn't just talking about mining jobs, he was just talking about jobs. And he was exactly right. It's been horrible to see over the last 40 years how his predictions, you know, came true.
It's interesting what you said about the policies in post-war Europe, that they were more socialistic than capitalistic one. And I was just working on a series of videos about such a phenomena as an American dream. And when you start to think about that, you realize that it's more socialistic than capitalistic one, because it was born in the 1930s when Roosevelt just started to implement its policies. 90% on the highest income tax, big investment into the development and policies like those. It's also a phenomenon which I think is more socialistic one, no?
Well, it's very interesting what you say there, Romance. You know, there's kind of 2 aspects to that, because, of course, the original American dream is that a poor person can come to America and make a huge fortune. And that's very much, you can escape your poverty individually as an individual, never mind everybody else, but you can, and a poor person can make it big in America. And of course, there was a small period where that was true. And people still today will point to, you know, Rockefellers or whoever, you know, who did generally, you know, in one generation go from poverty to oligarch. But of course, you know, that was a very small window of opportunity. It relied on a special set of circumstances that it was never going to come again. It's not the usual workings of capitalism. And then, of course, there's that other dream that you're talking about, which just means everybody can have a decent life. And we try to pay for, provide decent social provision with taxation on the rich. And that's as you say, it's a much more socialistic minded approach to the world. But of course, we have to be aware that vision of life, which was inspired by people's desire to have something like what the Soviet people had, i.e. to get away from constant insecurity, poverty, inequality, misery, you know, lack of education, lack of housing, lack of healthcare, lack of jobs, all of the insecurities that come with capitalism. So on the one hand, it was an attempt to present it as if capitalism is giving you all these things. And they're doing it by progressive taxation that puts most of the burden on the rich. We had the same in Britain. There was a band of tax paying, which was, you know, if you earn above that, then your earnings above this threshold are taxed at 95%. You know, we also had that in the post-war period. But there's 2 things I think that are really important to understand about that. That is, although it's presented to the people as if all their benefits are being paid for by progressive taxation on the rich, the truth is that really what underpins the ability of the state to pay those things is the super profits of imperialism from abroad. It was actually to pay for the welfare states in the West. They were turning the screws on the empire abroad. The bloodletting involved in keeping hold of colonies that were trying to break free and wrencing the maximum possible profit from them was horrific. And in fact, the British Labour government was making war all over the world while it was pretending to be, the socialist friend of the people at home. So that's something really important to understand, that under capitalism, when you get a welfare state, it's only in an imperialist country, and it's only really at the expense of the rest of the world. The other thing that happened because of this regime of very high taxation for incomes over a certain amount, the super rich, the oligarchs of the West, built their system of tax havens. They didn't used to have that. Now they do. Now you can't tell what they earn, or even who are the people who earn it, because they set up all these. Why is it the British Crown, the one that has all of these, of all their empire, what they kept hold of was little islands around the world, and they're all tax havens. They're all places where what goes on with money is completely opaque. Right? You can base your shell company there and nobody understands whose money goes in or out. The whole point of it is to evade these high levels of taxation. And once they'd got into it, of course, they weren't giving it up. But it was precisely in this era when there was genuinely high taxation on high incomes that the ones with the really high incomes found a way to evade all of this. So the high taxation has only actually ever been applied to high paid middle class people. On high salaries, PAYE salaries from a high paying job. Okay, they're earning a lot in the city as a lawyer or a stockbroker or whatever, but it's what comes to them through a pay packet and gets taxed by the government. But the people who are really wealthy have never been involved in this tax collection scheme. And that's something else. So the idea that everything was much fairer is also very confused one, because the really rich have found their way around the whole thing.
I have met Nicholas Shaxton in London something like 10 or more years ago. We were talking about that, and London was one of the centers of the global centers of the tax haven business.
And I think it still is.
Yeah. Other thing I wanted to ask you is about inequality, because the data shows that you have huge inequality levels in the Britain right now. I have met a professor, Richard Wilkinson, the other of Spirit Level in London some 10 years ago, and he said that inequality is not just about money, it's much more than that. It's about education, safety, social mobility, and in the end of the day, the mental health of the whole society. And I have also talked to psychiatrists, and they told me if there is one certain factor which affects the mental health of the society, he would say it's inequality. And as I see it, we have a huge problem nowadays, especially amongst young people. They have depression and other issues because they have this myth, or let's call it again the American dream, about opportunities, about equal opportunities, that if you will be working hard, if you will be smart enough, you will reach something. No, you won't. The levels of social mobility are close to a zero nowadays. But to be honest, it's really hard to spread this understanding.
Yeah. Absolutely. You highlight something really important there, Romans, and that is that the inequality continues to rise. And this is a feature of capitalism. It's not an accident. It's not an aberration. The small period of time where the inequality index was going the other way was that period of the post-war welfare state. That was the aberration. The problem is we have people who look back to that period as the only past they know. So they think that was normal and this is an aberration. But if you look at capitalism's whole history, and if you read Capital and understand the workings of the capitalist system, it's clear to you why that should be. Capitalism as a system concentrates wealth, concentrates all of the production of society in the hands of a tiny numbers of people, and progressively impoverishes the rest of the population. Marx shows very clearly that even in times when the absolute wages of workers might be going up, their relative position in relation to the rich, the capitalists, the owners of capital at the top of society is always going down. You know, the proportion of social wealth which goes to the working class gets smaller as time goes by. So we had this little blip when that seemed to be being reversed for a while. Now it's back in full force. And of course, it's a shock to a lot of people to see the level of poverty that British workers can be in, because their folk memory, for a lot of them, doesn't go back before World War II. But of course, the generation that lived through the 1920s and 30s and through the war, they knew poverty. They knew a time when you couldn't see a doctor because it was expensive. They knew a time when children went round the streets with bare feet, even in the wintertime, because they couldn't, you know, their parents couldn't afford shoes, when there was genuine, you know, malnutrition of a different kind. Now we have a different malnutrition rising again in Britain. It's harder to spot because it doesn't make people skinny, it makes them fat. It's malnutrition from eating hyper-processed but very, very cheap food, which has no nutrition, which doesn't develop your body properly, which causes all kinds of diseases, mental and physical, in your body from a young age, stops you developing healthily. But one of the side effects is obesity. So people talk about obese people like they've got to control themselves and stop eating. The problem is not to stop eating. The problem is they don't have access to decent nutrition. This is one of the ways in which we're seeing this rise of poverty and all of the horrible diseases that go alongside it. But we're also seeing, as inequality, as poverty, as homelessness, as so many unemployment, as all these things are getting so obviously worse, what we're also seeing is a real manipulation of the statistics. So, for example, the way the government counts unemployment, since the 1980s, when unemployment became a big social problem again, and of course it's continued to get worse and worse and worse since that time, the way they count unemployment changes literally every couple of years. So not only you don't get a true figure, but you can't compare today's figures to figures from 5, 10, 15 years ago, because they're not counted in the same way. And a whole load of people these days, they don't even count them in the unemployment figures because they've given up looking for work. So they're not unemployed, they're economically inactive, and you have to go somewhere else and find the number for economically inactive. But the figures that are cited everywhere as unemployed have been massaged and massaged and massaged so much that they don't make any sense anymore. It's the same with the figures for inflation. They keep changing because inflation's out of control. They just keep changing how they count it to try to tell us it's not as bad as we think it is. But in your actual life, you know that your pay doesn't get you anything, and it used to. I was with some family in Yorkshire at the weekend, and everyone was discussing, you know, it's kind of like a joke, but how much does an ice cream cost? You know, and literally it's become so expensive, and so many normal everyday things have become so expensive, it kind of leaves you unsure what's the right price. Like you go into a shop and they charge you some ridiculous amount for some small thing, and you're like, is that normal? You feel like you missed a meeting constantly because prices are going up and volume that you get for it is going down. You know, the inflation is clearly out of control, and yet the figures keep telling us, no, it's under control. And you're like, it doesn't feel like it's under control. That's not my experience in my life, you know. But you're absolutely right. You know, we're bombarded with propaganda about how great capitalism is and how it offers us choices, endless choices. And social media bombards us also with images of choices, makes us feel that all we have to do to have a nice life is choose what our life is going to be. Like they tell kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? As if you just pick a thing and you're going to be it. You know, you can't, but you're not allowed to say rich, right? And how do you become that thing, you know, that all of the steps in the way to doing that, and actually that presenting people with infinite choices is overwhelming and baffling, and all it does in the end is make you feel like somehow you failed to understand what the right choice was. You know, the reality is you're not given very many options at all. It's extremely hard to make it today as a teenager intact and with qualifications and feeling like you've understood something through your educational experience for many of the reasons that you've outlined there already. You know, that our our education system is under attack the same way our health system is under attack, at the same time that the number of people suffering from chaotic and deprived backgrounds is steeply rising. So teachers are ending up in a position where they're trying to manage problems in a classroom. They're not really able to teach. And on the other hand, education has become more and more detached from the reality of kids' lives. They don't feel a lot of the time like they've got anything to relate to about what they're being presented with. And there's many reasons for that. And of course, if they play up in class, they're branded as like useless or impossible to teach, and all the school wants to do is get rid of them. There's no vested interest in society, from society, in how can we help children reach their maximum potential and be positive contributors to society. The reality is there aren't jobs for everybody. So the ruling class is very happy to have an education system that spits a whole load of kids out, uneducated, in fact, functionally illiterate, a lot of them, and they get the message through years and years of classroom controls that it wasn't the system that failed, it was them. It's my fault I'm not educated, I didn't work hard enough in school, I'm stupid, all kinds of messages they get there, and they end up, without qualifications, without the ability to make choices. Even if you do really well in school and have more choices open to you, the reality is now in Britain, any educational opportunity is something you have to pay for. Even these days, a professional qualification to get you a promotion or help you advance in a particular sphere of work, you have to pay to get a master's degree before you'll be considered for that promotion. So in every direction, the ruling class is finding ways to get money out of young people rather than to invest in them. And to be able to get access to a even basically decently paying job, they've got to pay through the nose to do it.
And even if you pay, even if you get the right education, you are smart enough, we see that these social mobility, the social lifts don't work anymore. OECD data shows us the same thing, especially in Britain, but it's the problem of the whole Europe right now.
If I could just add one thing to that, is also that many years ago, I remember a report came out from, I think it was the World Health Organization, and they was focusing on health outcomes and societies where there was greater equality of health outcome through life. And of course, you end up with the same things. What did they find was the number one factor in bringing good health outcomes in a society, like across the board? It was early years education, and it was early years education of a certain type, which is based in the community. So not a farm to park children while the parents are working, but a genuine attempt to bring children up in a social way that really develops their faculties from very early on. And which are the countries that provide that? It's the socialist countries.
Yeah. But the problem I see right now is what's happening with the left idea, not only on the European stage, but globally. It's totally discredited with the same LGBT ideas and so on. Sometimes it looks for me that it's easier to reinvent left ideas and replace them with something new than to get them back in their traditional meanings. Look at what's happening with the socialists in the European Parliament. I will never vote for them. They associate left ideas with the same LGBT ideas, with the COVID spending and things like that. Not with the progressive income taxes, for example, and equality and these things. That's the problem, I think.
Well, left in the imperialist countries always meant left liberal. It always meant left social democratic. Social democracy has always been an agent of imperialism in the working class to stop them from making revolution. There was a period when, in order to stop the workers make revolution, social democracy had to very much look like it was socialist. That stopped being true after the fall of the Soviet Union. Today, social democracy looks very much like, and left liberalism look very much just like any old liberal, but with a bit of, instead of looking at class equality and the questions of class differentials and class relationship to the means of production, all they can find to pretend that they're interested in equality is this identity discourse, black versus white, women versus men, gays versus straight, and any division you can find. But the further away it is from systemic issues, the better, because it's like a garnish, and they turn those things into crusades precisely because they don't challenge the basic system of class relations. Bourgeois feminism is what they promote instead of women's liberation. Women's liberation is a question for the socialist movement because it relies on the abolition of class relationships. Same with racism. Racism is deeply entrenched into the system of imperialism because it's how the imperialists justify their wars abroad and their exploitation of colonial countries. They use racism to do it. So racism is a systemic issue, and you need to challenge imperialism to genuinely get rid of racism. They just turn it into a question of, have we got enough black people running companies or running in jobs in the police or jobs in the judiciary, running imperialism, put a few black faces and then that's equality. But it isn't, is it? The systemic issues remain in place. And the using gay liberation as one of these fights has been even better because you can absolutely satisfy all of the requirements of, equality of homosexuals without challenging anything about the system. And in fact, having decided to get rid of kind of anti-gay prejudice from its society, the ruling class in the West has found this is a brilliant weapon for then hitting other countries over the head with. So they pink wash themselves, they dress themselves up in clothes as the defenders of the oppressed, while going to countries which are trying to be sovereign and independent and hitting them over the head and trying to accuse them that they're awful, oppressive places, not like us. We're people who like freedom. Look how nice we are to the gay people. You're terrible to the gay people, therefore you're evil. And we are here to come and defend the gay people against your awful behaviors. And therefore it's all right for us to loot you, wage war on you, exploit you, bring down your government, practice regime change against you, all of the things that imperialism does. So pink washing has been a very useful way of pulling the wool over the eyes of well-meaning citizens in the West who do not understand what imperialism really is and what capitalism really is. I wrote a little book about this question, put a little plug for it. Identity Politics or Class Politics, it's called. It's very small, very easy to read, and you can get it from our shop online, and you can also download it as a PDF if you don't want to pay for it. So it's out there for people to read, but it just to kind of summarize the way these issues are used. But the primary thing to understand, I think, is that left, as in left liberal, the left wing of bourgeois politics is a million miles away from socialist politics, Marxist politics, class conscious, working class politics. Working class people need to have a politics and political organizations which is in their interests, and that has to be based on the understanding that the interests of the workers and the interests of the capitalists are diametrically opposed to one another. Our interests are in understanding the system and organizing ourselves so that we can overcome this system and create a planned economy that works in our interests.
I know that communism has a very long history in the UK, but still, our viewers mainly know Great Britain as a country which, for decades, was the main exporter of liberal ideas worldwide. British Communist Party sounds for them a bit like a Tsar of the United States or a great leader of Switzerland. So maybe you can explain what you are doing in the United Kingdom right now.
It's true. Britain was the first really consistently capitalist country with the first big industrial revolution, therefore the first global imperialist centre in London. And that has created a particular situation for British workers. On the one hand, we have a working class militant history that goes back further than anybody else's, because our proletariat is the oldest, and the first to get organized. Trade unions were invented in Britain. The early working class movement, like the Chartist movement of the British workers to fight for the vote, and for reforms to British politics and political institutions in favour of working class people. That was launched in the 1830s, but it was crushed in the late 1840s. And because Britain then became this huge global superpower, it was able to a certain extent to buy off some of the rebellion of big parts of the working class and create what Lenin talked about, the labour aristocracy. So we are a country that had a labour aristocracy before anybody else too. And so our labour aristocracy has been going a long time, and it has deep roots in the working class and in the British political establishment, and therefore is able to have, it has up until this day really monopolised control of the British working class movement. It's one of the reasons why the British ruling class is so able to get away with all its crimes abroad as well as at home, because the working class movement has been very highly controlled by the control of the Labour Party over all its institutions. For our party, the Communist Party of Great Britain, the first one, was set up in 1920 under really the direction of the Third International. There had been a group of socialist and Marxist-leaning parties up till that point, but they were split, and what they were split over was actually the question of their relationship to the Labour Party. Some of them tried to join it and act inside it, and others said, no, you must stay away from all that sort of thing. And under Lenin's direction and advice, they managed to unify. They tried to get entrance into the Labour Party. In the Labour Party's early days, it was a federation. It wasn't a disciplined party. And any organisation could join, and they could act as organisations within the federation. And Lenin said, if you can get in and you have freedom of expression inside there, it will be useful, because at that point in 1920, there had never been a Labour government in Britain. And Lenin said to the British communists, look, I understand, you're right, it's a bourgeois party, but the workers need experience to understand that that's the case. And if you can help accelerate that and bring it about, that's the right thing to do. So the new CPGB tried repeatedly to get access, to get affiliation to the Labour Party, but the Labour Party wouldn't have them. It blocked their entry time after time after time after time. It said, and it denounced Bolshevism endlessly. And in the end, the CPGB gave up on that and adopted a position of, attacking the Labour Party consistently from the outside. And they again, in the time of the Third International, they had this fantastic working class militant program that was called Class Against Class. It was a very clear program to the workers of Britain that says, our future is like the future that the workers of Russia are making for themselves, or the Soviet Union. Then by that point, we need a socialist future. We need a planned economy. We need to fight the class war to bring this about. So, and of course, during the 1930s, this platform was able to gain a certain traction amongst British workers because, of course, the failures of capitalism were very, very evident. The hardship that workers, the poor section of the working class in Britain went through in that period of time, as I said earlier, has been forgotten by a lot of people, but left great scars on the generation that endured that. So this is the history, the communist history that our party wants to revive. Basically, the period of the Third International, when we had a genuinely anti-imperialist, genuinely anti-capitalist, genuinely revolutionary, genuinely based on scientific socialism, Marxist communist party in Britain. This is what we are trying to rebuild. It's exceptionally hard to do it because that party, by the end of World War II, had huge prestige. It had branches all over the country. It had buildings all over the country. It had a daily press, and it was a real beacon for all the advanced workers in the country. Everybody knew a communist. Everybody knew where they could go to get the Daily Worker. So if people wanted to get their alternative media, they knew how to get hold of it, and they knew it would give them a different perspective than they were getting from the rest of the bourgeois media. That all started to be dismantled from 1950 onwards, when the CPGB, unfortunately, and that was even before the death of Stalin, to our great shame, wrote a new program, which it called the British Road to Socialism. And actually, our party's made a pamphlet on that as well. Let me just find it. Because this was the death of Britain's revolutionary movement. This program, the British Road to Socialism, basically said, now that Labour's in charge and we're getting all of these welfare state provisions, Britain no longer needs a revolutionary path. The British working class is going to get to socialism step by step, through reforms, through an alliance with the Labour Party, through putting pressure on the Labour Party to enact even more workers' reforms. And even in the first version of the British Road to Socialism, they talked about all the imperialist crimes of the Labour Party. But they still said, no, we now have a peaceful road to socialism and we're going to take it. And unfortunately, rather than recognizing they'd made a mistake, not long after that, Khrushchev came to power in the Soviet Union. And he started putting the same messages out to the whole world and filtering through the whole communist movement. So the CPGB then had a perfect excuse to stick to the mistake it had made and just tail after the Soviet Union, the peaceful road, peaceful coexistence, the parliamentary road, telling workers essentially that Labour Party is their party and the route to socialism is voting Labour. And of course, what that did is completely decapitate working class organization and consciousness. It took class conscious fighters that had been so influential in the working class in the 30s and 40s and turned them all into Labour Party activists, essentially. And of course, the communist movement has been dwindling away ever since and becoming more and more irrelevant, because what's the point in joining the Communist Party if Labour is the party of working class and voting Labour is the way to get socialism? I have a comrade who is, he's in his late 60s now. As a young man in the early 70s, he went along to the local, in our city, Bristol, there used to be a big building that had a daily worker banner outside it. It was the Communist Party headquarters for Bristol. He knocked on the door, went in and said, I want to join the Communist Party, please. I want to work for the Socialist Revolution. And the guy behind the desk said to him, oh, a likely young lad like you don't want to join, you want to join the Labour Party. Right? So that's the logic of their position. And of course, what did he do? He ended up joining a Trotskyite party because that party called itself revolutionary. And he had understood instinctively what we need as a revolution and socialism. So he, wasted years of his life being misled by Trotskyites simply because the communists had tied themselves to the Labour Party and to total reformism and were not doing the job they were supposed to be doing. So our party was formed just 20 years ago, but it was formed by people who began to be active in Britain in the late 1960s in the anti-revisionist movement. So we have a long tradition. My father, you may or may not know, Comrade Joti Brar, was our founding chair. He did a huge amount of theoretical work during his whole political life, but very particularly in the period of the decline and fall of the Soviet Union, to help people understand that what has failed is not socialism, it's revisionism. The socialism, the planned economy, remains humanity's future. The legacy of Lenin and Stalin is something we need to uphold and learn from. This was socialism in action, in practice. So literally in December 1991, as the Soviet Union was finally falling, my father and others in London launched something called the Stalin Society in Britain. And for a long time, that was the place where people who still believed that socialism was humanity's future would come and make presentations and listen to presentations either about the Stalin period of the Soviet Union or about, things that were happening in the world today, but through a Marxist understanding, through the understanding that we need to refound the communist movement in Britain. We need to hold the line for Marxism in this period where everybody's running away. The whole world is telling us socialism's failed, it's over, capitalism's triumphant. Joti was amazing as somebody who never lost confidence in Marxism. He was a very, very deep Marxist thinker. And the reason for that was he came into a movement as a young man. He picked up Marxism in the early 60s, and he was studying continuously from that moment on until he died in January of this year. And in all that time, his studies were showing him that this is absolutely the information that the working class needs in order to get to a better future. But he came into a movement that was riven with splits and divides. After Khrushchev launched his revisionist program for the world communist movement, I'm sure your viewers and you would know, that caused a huge split in the global communist movement between those that just followed the Soviet Union into revisionist dead end and those who tried to fight it. And those who tried to fight it went in many different directions. And part of that was really jumped on by the imperialists, who were really keen to exacerbate the splits and the differences and make them as extreme as possible, to set China and the Soviet Union against one another, to set all the different trends in the communist movement against one another, and to create their own false trends, which is basically what Trotskyism is. So Hopal came into the communist movement at this time, and he really set himself the task of, because everybody's claiming to be the new guru, or everybody's trying to follow an international guru. You're following the Soviet Union, or you're following China, or later, or you're following Albania. And Hopal was like, what we need to do is master Marxism ourselves, so we can evaluate what's happening here. Everybody's claiming to have the true Marxism, and it's not good enough to just find someone to follow. You've got to make sure you understand the basis for all these claims, so you can see what's happening. And the fantastic contribution that Hopal made to the British working class movement, although most of British workers have no idea that this has been done for them, but in the future I think it will be recognised, was to make a deep study of Marxism and always ally his practical work, and he was always an activist, but to ally his practical work with this theoretical understanding, to put a huge effort into producing Marxist analysis constantly throughout all of those years, and to make sure that a program of genuinely revolutionary, genuinely Marxist-Leninist thinking survived in Britain through a period when, without the work of him and a few close comrades around him, that line of Marxist-Leninist understanding and organization would have been totally broken.
But the first myth you have to break is that everywhere I go, I hear this: the Soviet project proved that socialism has failed. But nobody asks how many times capitalism has failed. Right? And there's the other side of this question. Nobody says that the Soviet economy in the period of time between 1930s to 1960s was the biggest phenomena in the 20th century, if not the whole history. I mean, that development which they made. So is it fair to call this socialism as a failed system?
100% not. No, not in any way. In fact, for me, the experience of the Stalin period of the Soviet Union in particular is my greatest inspiration, because it actually shows us what society, what humanity is capable of when a planned economy is being systematically put into place. And remember, Russia was coming from far behind in terms of its development in 1917 and 1920.
Really far behind.
It was very far behind. And yet, if you look at the curves of its development, you're right, humanity never seen anything like it. It was like that. And this was because in sphere after sphere, in a very organized, very thought through, very scientific way, they didn't do the Trotsky thing of just declaiming slogans like socialism means I spout a slogan and command everybody do this. No, they said, they looked at what they were trying to do, and at each stage they said, what's the thing we need to do to get to the next stage? So, for example, they didn't in 1924 say, right, we're going to collectivize everything. They didn't have the basis for doing it. They thought about how will we get there, and they laid the basis. This is scientific socialism in action. And all the way through that, they were mobilizing the people. The working class really felt they were masters of that society. That's why people look back to the Stalin period with so much pride and so much nostalgia, because they genuinely were the masters of their society, and everything they were doing was making their lives better. They worked really hard. They made tremendous sacrifices, but they did it together. They did it for themselves. They weren't exploiting any country abroad, and they were overtaking the West as they did it. And they were, they proved so many shibboleths of bourgeois society to be false. That unemployment is a problem that can be solved, that women are equal to men, that the colonized races can catch up. There's nothing inherently backward about them, that people of different cultures and nationalities and religions and backgrounds can live together in harmony, that society can advance without hindrance if you unleash the productive forces in this way. That there's a way to tap into the creativity of people through the planned economy, which enables society to really flourish on every level. In every single sphere, the Soviet Union was leading the way and making groundbreaking discoveries because it applied dialectical and historical materialism to every field of research and development. And it connected practice and theory in a way that the capitalists are totally unable to do. We have a situation in the West where something that's discovered in a research laboratory about people's health takes something like 17 years to make it into a GP's surgery. The Soviet Union did away with all that kind of, all those barriers, because the theory and the practice were linked together. They had research labs on collective farms, and the same during the Second World War. Why was the Soviet Union, which again had come from behind Germany in terms of its arms production in 1941, able to outproduce in just 3 years the Wehrmacht, and not just produce more, but produce better? The reason was they had a planned production system which enabled workers at every part of the chain to feed in their ideas for improvement. So someone who's working on a bit of the factory can say, oh, this bit of the thing we're producing, or this bit of the machine on which we're producing it could be improved with this little thing. And they could implement that quickly. And if it worked, they could roll it out across the whole country. This is a mechanism which allows a huge amount of iteration and feedback sort of in real time. This is a process. And they would get feedback from people using the equipment in the field. This is why still today, the AK-47 is the gun, that liberation fighters around the world want. Why do they want it? Because it works in all conditions. It's really easy to maintain and repair and all the rest of it, because it wasn't produced by a company whose aim was profit. It was produced with huge feedback by a system whose aim is what works.
But one more thing I wanted to ask you is, when it comes to the discussion of whether communism is working or not, there's a very interesting idea of David Graeber in his book, The Debt. He calls it the communism of the rich. I started to think about it and found myself that we can talk about two levels of it. One is the elites, which have access to the capital at almost no interest rates, and they have completely different access to information, and basically it's all you need to rule the world. It's unfair, but it works. The second lower level is relative communism or socialism in the big international corporations. I have worked for some time on a structure like this, and it's like a state without borders. Usually it has a pretty high level of loyalty inside because the relative income is a bit higher than the average outside the system. It has its own culture, even its own history. Only thing, it doesn't have its democracy. They don't even dream about it. But in this sense, communism works. I mean, if you look at those big corporations, they have planned economy inside. They have even something like own healthcare system inside, usually.
They want to take care of their workers, don't they? I mean, there's two interesting concepts you bring up there. One is, that quite often the petty bourgeois critics of capitalism who feel offended by monopoly capitalism because it's unfair. They see it's egregiously unfair, and they think there should be a level playing field, and because they don't really understand capitalism, and that there never has been and never will be a level playing field in capitalism. It's a process of the concentration of wealth, and once you reach the stage of monopoly capitalism, you've flipped into a whole new era. And Lenin described it very, very well in his book in 1916 on imperialism, that imperialism is the highest stage of development of capitalism, and free competition is basically been superseded by monopoly control of almost all industries. And of course, a bit of free competition and small capitalism exists alongside it, but it's constantly being swallowed up and pressed down. And so the petty bourgeois and the small capitalist feel constantly put upon by big monopoly capital. They are very, very insecure in this period, and so they will make a lot of critiques of the system. But the critique is always the unfairness, and we need to get back to a better time and a level playing field, and we need to control these monopolies or stop these monopolies, they're out of control, etc., etc. But so they will tend to use this phrase, communism for the rich. It's a nonsense, really, because communism doesn't have rich in it. But what they're referring to is something that Marx pointed out a long time ago. In Capital, he pointed out that in a capitalist society, the debt is always nationalized and the profit is privatized. So this is inherent to the capitalist system. The ruling state, the state machinery, is the organized dictatorship of the capitalist class, and the state is run in the interests of that class. The problem is, for us idiots at the bottom, we've been trained and brainwashed to believe the state is there for all of us, that it's a neutral body that's managing the affairs of the state in the interests of everyone. And because of our post-war experience, we have this feeling that maybe that's true. But of course, it's not true. It was never true. The ruling class's state in the period of capitalism is the executive body of the capitalist class. Its job is not to be fair. Its job is not to take care of everybody. Its job is to manage the affairs of capitalism for the capitalists and in their interests. So this phenomenon where the system is always skewed in the interests of the super rich, that's not a new phenomenon. That's a permanent feature of capitalism. It's not going to go without capitalism going. And you're right, inside, again, Lenin pointed this out, that monopoly capitalism, inside a monopoly, you have planning. And in fact, what Lenin showed was, for this very reason, monopoly capitalism is the era, it's the eve of the social revolution of the proletariat. We are just a tiny step away, actually, from socialism. Think about how easy the ruling class is making it for us to take over production. They've set up these huge bodies which can run and plan the production of some commodity across whole spheres of the world, certainly across all of the nation. All you have to do is step in and take over running that in the interests of the working class and not to make a profit. You've got this whole system, already set up for production, for distribution. All of that's being planned. The problem they come up against is, although they have planning internally, they're operating in an anarchic situation where there's no planning, globally or between one another. So that they're still, although they try to plan, they're still operating in a system of anarchic planlessness, which means that there's still a huge amount of waste. There's still gluts in the market. They're still constantly trying to work out how to shift product that they've made too much of because they didn't know what the market could absorb. So all the absurdities of capitalism still continue to exist, even while within the borders of these huge multinational corporations, there is a plan going on, and they are working according to, and they're planning bigger and bigger areas of the economy inside what's under their control.
And what's interesting that if we talk about growth in the Soviet Union between 1930s and 1960s and those very good results, it's hard to imagine what kind of results could be reached right now if you can use artificial intelligence in planning the modern technologies, right?
Absolutely. The continued developments in the means of production in technology and productivity mean absolutely that there's no bounds to the ability of our economy to grow. And as it's growing, to create better and better conditions of living for the people, actually with less and less effort by the people, right? It's a phenomenal ability we've created for ourselves. It's just the fact that these means of production are in the hands of a tiny number of people who can only use them to make profits that stands in the way of them delivering on their real capabilities. When you live in a capitalist system, every advance in productivity means more misery for workers. It means that the pay and conditions of the working class who are employed gets worse. It means the number of people who are unemployed gets higher. And it means that therefore the living conditions of the masses are getting worse all the time, even though our capability, the potential to deliver a better standard of living is constantly going up. It's an absurdity that can't but come into a massive collision very, very soon.
Jyoti, it was really nice to talk to you, and thank you that you found time for us.
No problem. Just yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.